Charles, welcome to the Floorplan. It's an absolute thrill to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
There's so many things I want to cover before we get into it today, but I think a good place to start might be around your way of thinking, which was really the first thing I noticed when I came across your work. I mean, you're clearly a systems thinker. You've got a background that spans a million disciplines: cryptography, mathematics, governance, agriculture. You've got a bison ranch, a health clinic, and many, many other fascinating projects. But I'm curious if there's an underlying pattern or principle that connects these seemingly quite disparate interests that you have.
I've thought about that a lot. What's the unifying principle behind all the work that I do? And some of it is implicit, where I just do these things, and then some of it I actually am fairly deliberate in the path. I think one of the unifying functions is the love of exponential technologies. I really love dealing with a technology where a very small amount of effort can create an exponential return. And so when you look at AI or blockchain, or you look at synthetic biology, a lot of these different fields, a small group of people, 50 people or 100 people, could build a product that could influence the lives of tens of millions to billions of people, which is a truly extraordinary thing. The other thing is the interdisciplinarity of stuff. I don't like problems that are single scope. Nothing's more boring in the world for me than to take one field of science and go as deep as possible in that, because you end up doing very technical, very specific things that are meaningful to the field, but utterly meaningless to any use case or application. And life is not verticalized. Life is interdisciplinary. You look at a system, there's biological concerns, there's physics concerns, there's engineering concerns, there's socioeconomic concerns. So everything that I do, I try to do something where it is a gestalt of many different things, so that I never get bored in the process. And so if you look at our work in cryptocurrencies, for example, Cardano is a breakdown of EPS, economic, political, and social systems all together. And you get to think of everything from foundational human rights and write those down in a constitution, all the way to very deep and detailed computer science. We're actually trying to figure out how to make these things behave at scale under adversarial conditions. And in many cases, there's no clue book. There's no cheat book. There's no answers in the back of the book for what to do. And rather, we have to invest quite a bit of effort and time into kind of creating foundational theories. And I suppose the last thing is first principles thinking. So I really do enjoy saying, okay, well, let's start from some bedrock somewhere of things that we know to be true, even if it's axiomatic. And then you just kind of build up from there. And little by little, you gain knowledge and experience, and you get a gnosis that is a little different from the norm.
I think we need a lot more of this type of thinking, multidisciplinary systems thinking. I always go back to Senger's work and others, and this ability to see patterns and how crucial that is for adaptation and innovation, especially in organizations. For people who might be struggling to develop that way of thinking, do you have any suggestions about how they could get better at it?
Well, I think it's less about, can people do it or not? I think it's more about social incentives. So academia is not incentivized for interdisciplinarity at all. In fact, it's very difficult to publish if you're a generalist. You only publish when you are really good at one little thing. So it's not like you're writing about 14th century history. You're writing about 14th century history in the south of France for people who worked on the windows of the papacy during the Babylonian captivity in Avignon. I mean, this is like how specialized you have to get, and then maybe have a paper, but then you have to start asking what was their gender identity or something like that. I mean, you're going all over the place with it. And so that's academia. And business is much the same, where generally speaking, a lot of people hyper specialize in business and become a domain expert in one particular thing. You could work for TSMC and you could be like the guy for molecular beam epitaxy, and not even MBE. Like, you're the guy for like one very specific type of MBE that involves using a specific element. And it used to be make big bucks that way, because if you're hyper specialized, you'd make a nice salary. But in the age of AI, what's happening is that the pendulum is swinging the other direction towards interdisciplinarity and generalists. because with the AI, you can hyper specialize. So it's much more meaningful to find connections between the fields. And that's how it used to be in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You had these Da Vinci-like figures that they were just good at everything and they were jack of all trades. And capitalism kind of moved us in a different direction. So I think people follow the incentives. And when you incentivize deep thinking and you incentivize interdisciplinarity, when you incentivize people to develop a wide breadth of skills, then they'll do that. When you incentivize people to go very deep in one thing, they'll go and do that. And now that we're moving the other direction, I think it'll naturally happen. And the good news is there's a lot of material for helping people develop that networked thinking. Like there's the
Yeah.
whole PKM revolution with personal knowledge management systems. You have things like Notion and Obsidian. And really the raison d'etre of that is the linked knowledge. And so people say, okay, I'm not going to go and look at categories. Rather, I'm going to look at notes that are filled with all kinds of interesting things. And then I'm going to connect them to other concepts. And then I create a graph. And then over time, knowledge emerges out of the system as a property, as opposed to some sort of artificial structuring that people put on. And learning those types of skills really help people navigate. And they start realizing that the world is actually more like that than it is in artificial categories and things.
Absolutely. And organizations are terrible at doing that as well. They get into deep silos, they don't share and translate knowledge
Yeah.
well. Was there a moment in your life when you started to think about challenging these traditional systems and thought, this is completely broken and I need to change it? Was there a specific landmark?
Yeah, I mean, it was my college days. I was really good at the deep thinking stuff, but I was a terrible student. I never showed up on time, and I didn't really enjoy the coursework. And I could have, if I was a bit more disciplined, probably gone through the whole rigmarole and ended up with a PhD, but I dropped out instead. It was never built for a person like me. I was equally interested in voting systems as I was mathematics, as I was quantum mechanics, as I was medicine. I did a little bit of everything, and it's like we call that homeless. There's just no degree to cover these types of things. So when you're an entrepreneur, it works really well because you have to be an expert on everything for 15 minutes, maybe 30, and then you can go on to your next topic to be an expert on. So I really enjoyed those challenges, but I didn't have a home, and nobody creates that home for you because society just doesn't work that way. And I was very fortunate to be in the cryptocurrency revolution where it's a deeply interdisciplinary domain. You're dealing equal parts cryptography with game theory, with distributed systems, with open source development principles, with fundraising and securities law and all these different things. It's a very bizarre field and it's very specialized in many different respects. But at the same time, it rewards people that approach it from kind of a different lens and viewpoint, especially given that you can write your own rules. We don't fit in any category, so people have to create legislation and they have to do things. And if you come with no pre-existing notions or biases, you actually do very well because you say, well, let's just build the optimal system instead of trying to pigeonhole the system into, a legacy concern like securities law or something like that.
Yeah. And that way of thinking and this long-term thinking, let's be honest, it's not very common. There are cultural differences. So I know you're in Japan at the moment, and it's very normal for Japanese companies to think about what's going to happen to this company in 100 years and what's my impact going to be, not just in this boardroom, but on the city and on, the entire nation, and because they have that collectivist focus. But you're from the United States, and a country that really values individualism and more short-term measures of success. So how did you cultivate that patience and discipline when all of our systems and measures largely demand immediate results? And I know that's a frustration of yours in the blockchain space as well.
Well, growing up in Hawaii helped because, it's half Japanese.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there. And also being homeschooled helped tremendously, because I wasn't indoctrinated in any particular system. So I didn't know any better of, where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. And so it gave me the freedom to fail and it gave me the freedom to experiment. But I just have good taste, I think. And I like things being beautiful. I like things being a testimony to the subtleties of where people spend a great degree of time and effort building something. So, there's 100 different ways you can put a building together, but if you have the old Japanese tongue and groove style, and some master craftsman spent quite a bit of time working on that, it just feels intrinsically better to me, even though it has the same function. And the problem with America is that we're so in love with tearing things down, and we're so in love with the new thing. So we build somebody up, we make them big, and then we say, well, now it's time to burn that person to the ground. It's almost like a sand mandala. You spend all this time
Yeah.
making it, and then you just go
Yeah.
and destroy it.
Right.
So that's always a challenge. And you never get any greatness this way, especially when you develop a love of the teardown, because then you're not on the same side as the creative people. One of the things that Japan does that makes it so special is that when people become fans of people, they want the person to win. They want the person to be successful. They want the person to go and do something great. And they'll go out of their way to try to help them and grow them. It's like cultural pride. When that person fails, everybody feels the failure. It's a collective shame. In America, we love to tear down our great people. A great example is Elon Musk, where he's kind of lost his way a little bit, and he's under constant assault, and so it's manifesting itself in very negative ways with him. And there's just a lot of people that really want this person to fail, and they're cutting their nose to spite their face, because at the end of the day, the business endeavors that he's working on are like the climate change thing and Tesla. He's working on getting us to be a multiplanetary species. I mean, Neuralink allowing the crippled to walk again. These are
Hmm.
not exactly like bad things. These are
Right.
actually quite beneficial to society, but they've just developed such an extreme partisan distaste for the person, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
If he feels like he's abandoned by all the people that love him and all of his friends, then he gets angry and lashes out, and it causes more people to attack him, lashes out more, and then you end up having this self-destructive cycle, and then he
Mm.
becomes the person that they say he is.
Yeah.
And the end result is just a net loss to society. It's a lose-lose. They just don't do that in Japan. It doesn't happen. It's not part of the culture. It's a very different thing. And if you want to build things that are collectively good for everybody, then I think you have to embrace kind of a collective work effort as opposed to this build up and destroy mentality that we have in the States.
Yeah, I think it's a good point here to step into some of these issues that you've talked about that drive this imperative for blockchain and these new models of governance. We're facing some pretty significant challenges, as you said, across social, economic, political spectrums. But for listeners who might not be as familiar, what are the breadth of possibilities in these realms that blockchain opens up?
Possibilities in which realms? I'm sorry, I broke up for a
Across,
second.
yeah, across the social, economic, political spectrum in terms of,
Oh,
this
yeah.
imperative and new models of governance.
Yeah. So the thing that blockchain solves, and it's deceptively simple, it's so powerful but so simple, is the trust problem. And a lot of people say, well, why do I care about this? So I always like to elucidate with an example. So let's say that you have a neighbor and you want to buy his land, part of his land. So if you trust your neighbor and he trusts you, you have a good relationship with him, then you go and you talk it out and you say, hey, I want to buy this land. Here's the price and here's the time we close. And oh, sounds great. You have dinner, you shake a hand, and you're done. Now, let's say a month into the transaction, you discover some problem. So what would you do if you both trust each other? You go and talk it out, have dinner again, and you figure out a solution, you shake hands, and you close the transaction. 2 meetings, very efficient, very low cost. Well, let's say you don't trust each other. What's the first thing you would do for a transaction? You get a lawyer, they get a lawyer. It's a tough negotiation. Then that problem occurs a month down the road, and you don't trust each other, so you can't talk to each other, so you sue each other. So now there's litigation. And let's say there's 2 years of brutal litigation, and you finally resolve it, you win, you get the land. Now, the end result in both cases is the same. You have acquired a piece of property. The difference is tons of legal fees, a lot of time, a lot of heartache and pain, and just unproductivity. So the cost of the lack of trust is commercial friction and social friction. And that gets exacerbated at the end from individual emergently to the organization to the government. And so what blockchain does is it creates a new system. And what that allows you to do is say, okay, I can start trusting the things I see, the transactions, and the commercial activities. So, for example, voting in the United States, when Trump lost in 2020, he said, oh, the whole voting system is rigged. And half of my country was running around saying that was a rigged election. In 2000, the other side did it with Bush v. Gore. When Bush won and Gore didn't, oh, the whole system's rigged, it's broken, the Supreme Court hacked the election. So, people have grievances with the election depending on who wins and who loses. Well, here's the problem. I, as an American, can't verify my vote. So if I vote, I don't know if it was counted, and I don't know if the whole system has high fidelity. You put it on a blockchain, you actually gain inclusive accountability with that. You can actually check that your vote was counted correctly, and that the integrity of the system as a whole looks good. So then it takes the discourse of the voting system is broken out of the commons. And now that's above reproach because we can all check that. So suddenly you're no longer debating whether the system's legitimate or not. You're debating, well, why did that outcome happen? So all these social institutions, whether it be the acquisition of land or voting or truth on social media is another good one. In the age of generative AI, it's getting increasingly difficult to determine what's real and what's not real. We're getting perilously close to a world of deep fakes being a real thing.
Yeah.
Probably in the next 24, 36 months, picture perfect video, audio, and representations of people can be generated and broadcast so that basically can make people say and do whatever you want. So what happens is that we lose truth in that process because anytime somebody, you see something, people just say it's a deep fake. Oh, there's a video of you and this woman, or there's a video of this and that. Oh, that's a deep fake, right? It's the Shaggy defense. Wasn't me. So when you live in a world like that, then nobody can trust each other anymore because you no longer converge to a common shared reality. So you need tools to be able to create trust amongst those who don't trust each other, especially in global business. Like when we look at what's happening geopolitically, we're moving from a rules-based international order to a great powers conflict geopolitical structure. And there, instead of having like the international courts and the IMF and all these things where we have trade agreements and every nation state agrees to follow those rules, you're moving into empires. So Russia just takes stuff and America just takes stuff like Greenland or whatever. And then you have China just takes stuff. And if you live in that world, what does a trade agreement mean? What does a commercial agreement mean? And how can you hold companies accountable? Like, how can we hold a Chinese company accountable for carbon production? How can we hold a Russian company accountable? How can a Russian company get intellectual property rights? Let's say somebody stole one of their patents in the United States. Like, is a Russian company going to go to a U.S. court and sue them for that? So you have to move the assets and the transactions and the people out of this old Westphalian legacy notion of commerce into a commons which preserves and protects trust. And really the only space that we have is the blockchain space to be able to do that. So these are the kinds of things that get me quite excited and why I'm still passionate about this field, because I think its time has come in a world where we just don't trust each other anymore.
Absolutely. So a lot of people see decentralization as this ideal, but there is the question, isn't there always, of who builds it, who maintains it, who governs it? Is it really true decentralization?
Yeah, and there we ask the same question because we always think from first principles thinking. It's one of the reasons why we have 240 papers and almost 10,000 citations. It's been a lot of work, but one of the most promising areas of research has been decentralization as a whole. Like, what is the definition of it? And it turns out there's 8 different lenses that you can look at decentralization through, from the network stack to the tokenomics to how the code is governed. And so you may be very decentralized in one, but you may have terrible distribution of another. So, like Trump coin is a great example where, from one lens, it's fairly decentralized. There's many holders. It's on a network that's somewhat decentralized. Anybody has access to it. But from another lens, it's hyper-centralized because one entity has 80% of the supply. So you always have to say, well, decentralization is kind of a referential thing. So who is asking the question and what are they trying to achieve with it? So we created something with the University of Edinburgh called the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. And the goal of the index is to measure decentralization from these different lenses with the University of Edinburgh to things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and then you start getting numbers, numerical values that you can look at and you can reference and compare. Now, why these are important is that the lack of decentralization gives you, as a policymaker and as a business, some sense of where the failure modes of the system can occur and where you would need disclosure, consumer protections, or additional software to protect yourself. For example, if you rely on the price for security, and there's one actor that has an overwhelmingly large amount of supply, something happens, that actor crash the price, you may lose 90% of your security inside your network. So that's a pervasive issue with proof of stake systems, but not proof of work systems, as an example. If you rely, well, indirectly, but directly, it would be the issue. Indirectly, still, the mining value goes down. So you'll see it's a leading indicator of hash rate falling, but it's not as direct as proof of stake, I should say. In the case of like your network, if there's like only 3 nodes, like three network infrastructures that are maintaining the majority of your nodes, let's like Amazon Web Services or something, if there's a global outage of that service, your entire network may go down. So, this gives you an adversarial model of trying to understand like where and wonder what conditions will the network break. And what's really cool is when you start playing that game, then it gives you a nice roadmap for places that you can tinker and improve the decentralization of the system where and when it makes sense. Now, there's always a price. Decentralization is not a free concern. It requires redundancy. It requires additional investments and in making the system resilient. And almost always, it's more time, effort, money. And typically, it slows down the performance of the system, which is why you also have to ask yourself, like, where does your incentive sit?
Right.
That's why you see things like SWI and Solana and these other things are perfectly fine systems. The problem is they're optimized towards centralization because they gain sub-second latency from that. They gain lots of transaction volume for that. They gain all these advantages with the system for being centralized, but they're brittle. They're very fragile. And when they go down for everybody. So, the market has to decide what it values. Does it value resilience and decentralization, or does it value performance and throughput in centralization? And unfortunately, consumers tend to pick the things that make their lives the easiest, but aren't necessarily the safest in the long term.
Right. And how do we create these new systems to reconcile with this short-term price or reaction-driven, the shareholder return, the short-term political term?
That's the $64,000 question. There certainly is a market for it, or else Cardano would exist. And there's a price point there. And there is also a price point for Bitcoin that people seem to agree with. Like most things in cybersecurity, usually it stems around the monster of the week. And so when a problem occurs, people tend to say, oh, we really need to invest in solving that problem. So usually, a big company will be very ambitious about cybersecurity the day after a major attack on their infrastructure. And the CEO says, we need to solve that. But Bruce Steyer's written, he's a very famous cybersecurity expert. He's written many essays about the chronic underfunding of cybersecurity and the chronic underfunding of things that are long-term good for the system. I think the way you do it is you have to reimagine your incentive system. And so as a thought experiment that I like pushing, imagine that instead of living in a single monetary system, you live in a dual monetary system. And so you have today money and future money. And let's say future money is only spendable 200 years in the future or something like that. So you don't actually get to use that, but you can only earn it by doing something for the future. So like if you plant a tree today and it benefits something in the future, you make some future money or something. So if you create an incentive system like this, then what you do is you retune capitalism in a way where you create marketplaces for things that don't have an immediate impact, but rather they have a long-term impact for everybody. I think it's the only way that we solve global problems and coordination problems and get over agency failures and mistunings of short-term issues. Or otherwise, you have to get lucky and you start losing the ability to do long-term investments. Like Microsoft, for example, is one of these anomalies where they were willing and able to do a long arc investment. They had Majorana, a topological quantum computer investment, where they spent 17 years working on it. And it was just extraordinary amount of money and time, and it survived multiple CEOs. Bill Gates was the first to think about it, and then Ballmer was the custodian of it, and then Satya Nadella, is the person who finished it. But it gives you a sense of how rare that is, and for something like quantum computing, that's probably the scale and level of investment you need to make to be able to make meaningful progress in the field as a whole. But if you're always thinking quarterly returns, quarterly investment, you just can't get there. So as the world gets more complex, you start losing resolution. You start losing the ability to actually get things done. So I think it's economic tuning. And the good news with cryptocurrencies is that we have a toolkit for economic tuning, and it's called tokenomics. So you
Mm.
can structure your tokens in a way where you can create incentives in the short, medium, and long term for a variety of different initiatives. The hope is that over time, that can change the orientation of the thinking of people.
Mm. Trust is not at a great point at this point in the cycle. As you said, we've had a lot of self-interest, grifting, presidents launching meme coins, all kinds of things going on. And people make decisions based on that subjective trust. So what do you think are the most significant barriers at the moment to increasing that trust in the space and to broader adoption? And how can we overcome them?
I wish I had a mechanism to change how the space operates. It seems that the people who want to think long term are typically not invited to the table. The crypto summit is a great example of that. Not in the people who were invited, but the absence of certain people. Vitalik Buterin didn't get an invitation. CZ didn't get an invitation. I didn't get an invitation, and many, many other good people were not invited. And the people who were invited were kind of the flavors of the week of things that are either directly connected to the president or they're connected to businesses that are popular at the moment. So it almost became a popularity contest. In fact, the White House went out of its way to say Charles wasn't invited. Not sure why. They didn't do that for anybody else, but okay. That's a pretty dick move.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have an investment in long-term thinking, you get short-term outcomes. So all I can do is just basically work within my ecosystem. And there we spent 2 years working on governance. We got Voltaire done. We have an on-chain constitution that's the artifact of more than 50 countries participating and working. We have 1,000 plus DREPs, and so we have fully decentralized governance in our system. And we're talking about roadmap and budget items that will persist over a many-year period. And some of the investments we're making now will not be relevant in 2025. They will take many years to work their way through into the protocol. But that inculcating that thought process into Cardano has yielded a lot of fruit over the last 10 years, and it's allowed us to solve a lot of very hard problems. So that's all I can do is just focus on that. I can't do much about consumer trust because you very rightfully so point out, you're kind of alluding to that consumers see what they see. And they see Trump coin and they see this very short-term stuff and they see a very surface level understanding. And people know that there's something going on, but they develop almost immediately either a repulsion or an affinity based upon shallow facts and that have nothing to do with the actual purpose of the space and why we do what we do. So it's a challenge. It really is. And it's deeply frustrating at times, especially having spent 15 years of my life, in this industry. And I'd like to believe been a good citizen of the industry with the contributions we've made. To not have a seat at that particular table is deeply frustrating because effectively it makes it very unpredictable for where the United States is going to go and how policy is going to evolve. And that's going to have an enormous impact on European policy, enormous impact on the Five Eyes, enormous impact on Asian policy, African policy, Middle East policy, positive or negative. And one can only hope for the best with
Yeah.
that.
And that we can shift this perception that we haven't got beyond speculation and that people aren't really aware of the kind of things that you're doing largely outside of the industry. So let's talk about the Cardano governance journey and where you're at now. You've had some fantastic successes, especially towards the end of last year. But as you said, it's been a long process. So where are we up to and what is the next step?
Well, there's kind of three things we have to get done this year to demonstrate that governance is working at scale. One of the three is already done. We had to get the Constitution ratified on chain, and that was successfully done a few weeks ago, 85% approval rating, which is pretty extraordinary to get
Yeah,
people all around the world, many of which have never met each other, 85% to say yes. I mean, you can't
great
do that
result.
on anything, even like, hey, do you want a ham sandwich? It's pretty crazy.
Right.
So I'm very, very happy about that. But then the second thing is ratification of the roadmap, and that's an annual concern. And ratification, and the third thing is ratification of the budget. So we're in the mix of things. But what's nice is it flexes all of the mechanisms of on-chain governance. The institutions like Intersect, the Foundation, and others have to take complexity and turn it into simplicity, and work with the on-chain government to help them in their decision making. The on-chain government has to debate things and redline things and say, this is what we like and this is what we don't like. We have to have the fight, and then we have to survive the fight. And if we do that, it's an indication the system is working well. And in all governance systems, you tend to look for three properties, and it's rare that you get all three at once and all three at the same time. So integrity, efficiency, and efficacy. So integrity is how well do you preserve the founding intent of the system, and that's defined usually by a constitution or some governing document. So now that we have a constitution, we have a mechanism upon which to measure whether integrity is preserved or not. Efficiency is how quickly you make decisions. And so you can have governments that are highly efficient, like the Politburo in China. They want to go and burn a city down. They can do that in 24 hours. They're very efficient. Look at the train to Tibet they're building. They're drilling through mountains and these things. But efficacy is if you make decisions, do you make the right decisions or wrong decisions? So typically you have to have a roadmap or a goal set. So these things are always in reference to anchors. And so integrity is always in reference to a constitution or something like that as a founding document. And then effectiveness is typically in reference to a roadmap. And then ultimately your KPIs that you care about in the system. So you can look at things like token price or TVL. You can look at things like transaction volume, node count, dApp. There's all kinds of meaningful metrics or vanity metrics that you can chase to help you kind of navigate the space. So we have a governance system, and now this year we'll see if that governance system is integrity preserving, efficient, and effective. So passing of a roadmap, okay, if we do that quickly, it's efficient. And if it's a good roadmap, then it's effective. And if the roadmap preserves our constitution, it's integrity preserving. And then passing of a budget, exactly the same. And unfortunately, I can't tell you if it's working or not. I have to wait and see the system work its way through. And then I'll come back in a year and I'll say, Libby, I think it's great. Or I'll come back and say, oh, it's a horrible failure, and commit seppuku, so.
Don't do that. But it's such an important thing to do, but it's hard, isn't it? Decentralized governance is hard. And sometimes you think about, do people really want the responsibility of governance, or do they just want things to work? And I know you've talked about the frustrations with that budget process, right? In terms of thinking about, well, what actually delivers value and that short-term focus again.
So any good social curation system is very good at tuning out noise. They have good signal filters, and they hone in on the signal and they filter out the noise. So the first thing everybody does in 21st century society is play the victim. So you can go in and be an utterly distasteful, horrible person who contributes absolutely nothing. The minute that somebody holds you accountable for it, you immediately play the victim and say, oh, yeah, I'm being persecuted. I'm calling truth to power and all these other things. That is what it is. That's what people do in the 21st century. And unfortunately, the media does give them a platform and reward them. So that's why that behavior is apparent. And algorithms and social media amplify them. So you have to ignore those people and just basically pretend like they don't exist. And what you do then is you got to filter down and say, okay, what are the meaningful things to discuss? And, what is also the benchmark for success? You have to look at, okay, where are we at? Where do we want to go? And what is our tolerance for risk and failure? One of the reasons why NASA isn't doing so well historically in the last 30 years is that after Columbia and Challenger, it created a culture in NASA that failure cannot happen. So what that translates to is we can't take risk. So every single thing we do, we're quadruply redundant, and we have all these checks and balances and everything. So it takes 20 years to do anything.
Yeah.
NASA in the 1960s, they're blowing up stuff all the time. People burnt to death the original Apollo astronauts in a capsule. It was very dangerous, and all their astronauts were test pilots who had like a death wish. But that type of culture allows you to go to the moon within 10 years. So you have to tune what is your tolerance for failure, what is your tolerance for risk, and create a culture accordingly. And for things that you already have the network effect and you already have the scale and you're already very successful, usually the culture is don't fuck it up. So don't reduce don't do anything to destroy
Don't break
everything.
it.
Yeah. Like Microsoft's in this situation with a lot of its product lines. They got 3 billion customers. What are they going to do? Like triple their customer base? It's not going to happen. Okay, they've already saturated the known totality of humanity at this
Right.
point. So you're not really going to get brownie points at Microsoft Windows for doubling the user count, but you will get fired if you screw up Windows, as Steven Sinofsky learned with Windows 8. So failure is not tolerated in that type of system. Whereas you startup, like rapid customer acquisition is the important part. And so having perfection is problematic because your business model isn't set, your feature set is not set, it's not clear. So this is something we have to kind of get sorted out inside our ecosystem, is trying to figure out that
Yeah.
balance of perfectionism and protocol design and formal methods and peer review, like doing it the right way
Right.
versus the things that are required for rapid customer acquisition. And where and when we get it right, it's magical. And what's nice by bringing more voices in decentralization is that you avoid groupthink, and also you really start amplifying that signal that's going to help you find that right product market fit and that right balance of things. And you filter out the bad signal. And certainly there's going to be a lot of people along the way that are fair weather, and they're very frustrating, and they just say and do things that it just gets you so pissed off. But you can't let them define the narrative, and you can't let them define all the people. The vast majority of people don't care.
Yeah.
You just
Yeah.
don't,
I don't.
and it's like what incentive? It's called rational ignorance.
Yeah.
What incentive do they have to care? So you can't take it personally, and you just have to keep moving forward and get it done.
Mm. You've talked about the implications of this inflection point that we're at with globalization and technology. And I'm really interested in what you think about this for our models and paradigms of work, because I think that one of the reasons that people don't care and that we get this kind of behavior is because we've had a breakdown of psychological contracts around work and lack of trust and this kind of crisis of meaning and purpose at work and in the world. And so a lot of people are kind of living these lives of sort of quiet desperation, I think. Well, crypto is going to be the way out. That'll save me. I'll attack anyone that stops that. So how can these new models that we're talking about in terms of blockchain and governance and maybe new models of organization enable a new form of work that, I mean, we're so stuck in such a decades old hierarchy here that really isn't shifting?
Yeah, I guess you have to ask, like, where's the nexus of marginalization occur? Um, Anybody, no matter what the power dynamics are, can feel very marginalized if the system is sick and poorly constructed. I'm in this weird paradoxical situation where, on one hand, I deeply, deeply, deeply care about the cryptocurrency industry and the success of Cardano and the growth of Cardano. On the other hand, I've been put into this weird position where I've been excluded from a process on the executive branch of my country.
Yeah.
And basically, they said that I'm not involved, I'm nothing to do with this. And they're actively doing things with us not in the room. And when you're in that weird position that you get bitter about it, and the danger is then you start saying, well, I just don't care and I'm going to disengage and I just don't care where they take it and what they do. The only reason I care is that I want it to have a good outcome for the people who use the product and for the philosophy and mission of the product.
Mm.
But now all of a sudden I care a little less about whether cryptocurrency businesses are nexus in the United States. And that's bad for me as an American. Especially if I think this industry is going to grow exponentially and it's going to massively improve our job count and our GDP and these other things, because I'm excluded from that process. And it's a very natural human thing to
Right.
feel. And you think about how many systems exist, whether people experience racism or, people get victimized in some way or they get harshly criticized, how they just start checking out and disengaging from
Mm.
that thing as a whole. So that's a challenge. And I think the key to get through it is to go back to first principles and say, well, why are we here? Why are we doing this? And also realize that sometimes when you build these systems, you're not building these systems for today. And you're
Mm-hmm.
not building these systems for the people of today.
Right.
Trump's 77 years old. No matter what happens, he will not be president in 2029.
Mm.
But the decisions made, the infrastructure we build could be in use in 2050,
Yeah.
2100, 2200. And so under those circumstances, you're saying, well, I'm doing this as a legacy concern where I want to leave a better world for everybody. And I want to
Mm.
build something so that people find it in a better state. And that helps, I think, re-enfranchise, because no matter what's going on. The people of the future haven't wronged you.
That's
What's
right.
going on? They
Exactly.
haven't disenfranchised you, right? They're
Yeah.
completely blameless and victimless, and you can
Right.
imagine them being far more enlightened, and you can imagine them being far more patient and
Mm-hmm.
nicer and more
Mm-hmm.
empathetic,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they're given the gifts of good ideas. So you keep the work going for the next generation. You keep the work going for them, and you keep pushing forward. And that's how I think you also can incentivize engagement, and that's how you unify people. Because
Mm.
when you start talking to all these other people, they have all these grievances. And I say, oh, it's very true you have these grievances. But has anybody in the year 2100 wronged you in any way? And they're like,
Mm.
no. How could they? It's like, we have to wait 75 years for that to happen. Exactly. So why don't we make the world better for them?
Mm.
And when they start thinking this way, and they say, yeah, that's actually a pretty good point. It's kind of like the Iroquois with their seventh generation concept. So you kind of just think to the future, and that's how I think you motivate and expand the dialogue and thought a little bit. And the other thing too is that having empathy for people, and you realize where people are coming from and how people behave, um, it helps you at least create some meaning into their actions and to where they're at. Everybody in that orbit is deeply scared.
Mm.
They're
Yeah.
they're traumatized. There's
Mm-hmm.
problems that this occurred. They feel they're wrongfully convicted 34 felonies. They feel that the entire government was weaponized against them, and they're lashing out and being very angry about a
Mm.
lot of stuff. And so everything is just like, take everything that's not bolted down. That's the mentality that they have right now. It's a survival instinct, and
Mm.
it's an entitlement instinct. Like the prior regime did all these horrible things, so we're allowed to do all these horrible things too. That's the standard that's been set. So they're in an eye for an eye mentality, or a very base retribution mentality. That's not sustainable. And at some point, they'll either have to evolve or they'll stall out, because they'll all turn on each other and everything will go to hell. The other thing is, you'll just run out of stuff to steal. You'll run out of stuff to break. You'll run out of fuel for that
Mm-hmm.
madness. And then at some point they have to go back to some other transcendent thing. In fact, I was with a Republican person the other day, and I asked him, what does it mean to be a Republican?
Mm.
Because I was a member of the party, and I know a lot of people there, and I consider myself more conservative than liberal. And I remember William F. Buckley. I remember these types of thinking that we have. It just, we can't get an answer anymore of what it means. It's a
Mm.
completely bizarre notion. So that's an unhealthy system. And I think it's a justification for the social work that we do with blockchain and the profound consequences it has for economic, political, and social systems. Because when you implement this, you go from don't be evil to can't be evil, and then the system won't allow you to deviate into these bizarre worlds, even if you want to.
Yeah.
Humans are really bad when they don't have checks and balances. And
Mm.
humans are really bad when nobody's there to stop them from doing bad things. Elon Musk is a phenomenal example. He's worth $500 billion. He's surrounded by sycophants. He can't be fired, no matter how egregious his behavior is. I'm just thinking about basic corporate governance at Tesla,
Mm-hmm.
where you have this guy running 20 companies. He's got 13 kids. He's now just MIA to go hang around with the president running Doge every day.
Right.
Tesla stock's down 50%. It's looking very grim. Normally, a board of directors would call an emergency meeting and basically say, either you go back to work as CEO of Tesla, or we have to let you go and
100%.
replace you. Where's the board? Where's the governance there? It doesn't
Yes.
exist. There's no oversight. And
Right.
so in the absence of that neurotic behavior, it grows like a cancer, and it
Yeah.
gets worse and worse and worse, and it enables and enables and enables, and then eventually you start lying about stupid shit like, Diablo 4 records or Path of the Exile or whatever it is, and say, oh, I'm the world's greatest gamer, look at me. And it's like, why would you lie about that? It
Why
just
would you
doesn't
do
make
that?
any sense. But from the lens of this malignancy and growing up, it then suddenly you can call Mark Kelly a traitor, a
Mm-hmm.
guy who flew fighter jets in Iraq and is an astronaut. And then,
Right.
suddenly you call astronauts retarded, who are
Mm-hmm.
sitting on the space station, who are kind of subject matter experts about things. That's all just fine. And then you'll
Yeah.
have this legion of enabling people saying, well, this person's so brilliant, he can't make any problem. You can't do that. You can't build a government this way. You can't build people this way. it doesn't help in any sense. And it creates an environment where progress is stalled because it lives and dies by the whims and wills of an individual who's unhealthy. So it is probably the biggest reinforcer of the mission we have. And when we see stuff like this, it makes us passionate again because we say we can't let that be the standard. We can't let humanity continue to go down this road. We need systems that are built on bedrock that don't have these properties and people can't abuse them in these particular ways so that the systems can endure long term for everybody.
Absolutely. I think, where other boards, we had this situation with Qantas with our previous CEO, where took the airline down a whole lot of very questionable paths, ended up in a lot of litigation, huge loss of customer confidence, and they were largely silent, just in a much smaller but similar way in terms of,
Yeah.
well, what's happening. We're supposed to have this compliance. We've got these strict structures, but Alex Haslam, who's up at University of Queensland, he wrote a brilliant paper about this zombie leadership, right? That we have these dead models of what we think a good leader is or what they're allowed to do that are largely unsupported and just held up by the media. And people just keep blindly following them in the way that you just said, whether it's the board, whether it's, the general public, the employees. So I often think this is a kind of tricky question, but if you had to design a company from scratch today, because people who've got power in general don't want to give it up, right? So they're going to resist this change and these new opportunities that you're talking about, which is so essential. They're going to resist that, to the death. So if you were to design a new company from scratch, no legacy systems, no outdated hierarchies, how do you think we could
Right.
structure it and how would decisions get made?
Well, we thought a lot about this, and we know everybody in this business. How do you push power to the edges business? So we know the people who do holacracy and sociocracy, and it's not a new endeavor. The co-ops have existed since the 50s. I think
Right.
Mondragon was one of the first in Spain. So
Yeah.
people who study organizational design, they know these things. I do believe that the holacratic way has really laid out a very compelling story about saying authority, ownership, and decision making should be more circular than a pyramid.
Yes. Right.
You should have domain experts in circles, technocratic circles, and link them together. And that's usually how you make good decisions. And incentives have to be aligned appropriately. If you see a failure in a system, it's either a failure in organizational design, a failure in communication, and knowledge flow in the organization, or it's a failure of incentives when you see these types of failures. And then systems are supposed to have immune systems like a living organism. And if a system doesn't have an immune system, it doesn't self-correct. So when the CEO does something wrong, if the CEO doesn't get fired or the CEO doesn't get disciplined, you have a broken system. And if that is a culture that permeates, then your system will get sicker and sicker, and it'll become a kleptocratic crime-fi spree. And when a political system does this, typically it's self-correcting in that the nation gets weak and then they get conquered by a great power. We saw that in Rome, for example, when the
Right.
Goths came down and sacked Rome. And we saw that with the Greeks as well. The Athenians got sacked by the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War. So it can happen, and America is at danger of being kind of conquered by China if we continue going down this road in political sickness. But if I had to design something from scratch, I would look at the arc of history and say, okay, there are three truths that are invariants, that you can't violate them. They're always there. One, humans are corruptible and will always let you down in relationships and in business, whatever. And then people, oh, you're so cynical and pessimistic. I say, no, I'm a realist.
Yeah.
If your definition is perfection, you'll be deeply disappointed in 6 months to a year. Everyone will let you down in some way, somehow, sometimes small, sometimes large. But human beings, because of the way we're wired, we can't be perfect. So never build a system relying on virtue alone. Never build a system relying on human beings to be honest or competent or capable. You have to build systems that assume that bad things will happen because humans don't do their job.
Right.
That's why in cybersecurity, we always assume that there will be some penetration of the system. It's not about preventing the attacker from getting in. There will always be a case where the attacker will get in. And so what do you do after they get in? That matters. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that any system where the incentives are misaligned will never be stable. So if one person makes all the money and everybody else doesn't make any money, eventually the workers will kill the boss. We call that communism.
Yeah.
So it'll happen one way or the other. People will leave.
Yeah.
A great example is Fairchild Semiconductor. It was very poorly designed. Shockley was very poorly designed. Even though he invented the semiconductor, his people left and created Fairchild. Later on, went and created Intel. So there's many examples of that where employees just simply leave because the incentive structure is broken, and they go and create a more fair incentive structure for themselves. And in Silicon Valley, has thousands of these stories floating around. I say the third thing is that good systems recognize good people, and bad systems elevate bad people.
Yes.
So if you have a good organizational design, then you have to be able to recognize that some people are domain experts and figure out how to get them incentivized and motivated to apply those skills for where you need those skills. So those are three fundamental first principles that any system that you construct has it. And I'd say a fourth principle that is kind of a meta principle is that you always design a system for an output you wish to affect in an environment that you assume. You
Mm.
could have the perfect system, but if it's embedded in the wrong environment and it's
Mm.
embedded with the wrong goals,
Right.
even though it's a well-constructed system, it's going to fail. A great example would be you could have a perfect co-op and everything look great, but let's say you're in Eastern Ukraine.
Right.
It's like, does that really do anything for you? No, you're in a state of
Mm.
total war.
Mm.
Your employees are being drafted and dragged to the front lines. You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
this
Doesn't help.
it's not a it doesn't really do much for you. Or the same being like in Poland in 1939, it doesn't do anything for you. So
Mm.
bad outcomes can also be a macro concern, which is something that you can't really recover from until those concerns have been alleviated. So there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs on the
Yeah.
nation state level. Let's say for economy, if you found your company with the best of intentions and resources are scarce and finite, if your model assumes abundance, well, then, it's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't do in a Great Depression style environment a quantum computer company or a fusion company or any of these deep forward thinking things because things are so scarce in that environment. People are in survival mode. So when you found a company like optimize your food rations by 20%, everybody's your best friend, but they're not really going to be thinking, gosh, how do we make an artificial sun on Earth in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years? Is that we'll get back to that when the
Mm.
economy improves. So you
Mm.
have to also understand your environment in a way that helps you navigate that. But I'd say those three design principles are universal invariants. And no matter what the conditions are, you have to acknowledge and build around those. And then you have to be really good about predicting what your environment is and setting clear goals. And also, do people understand the goals? Do people agree with the goals? Many
Mm.
cases, people foundationally disagree. And unfortunately, we have this culture, instead of disagree and commit, we have this culture of disagree and resist.
Resist. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
Mm-hmm.
people say, I'm going to stick around and I'm just going to do everything I can to poison the process. One of
Yeah.
the most common things in bureaucracies you'll see is people adhering to the letter of the order, not the
Yes.
intent of the order. So
Yes.
they'll be like, oh yeah, I'll do exactly what you told me to do.
Mm.
As for example, if I said an email, show up on Tuesday at this time. Well, if we all change the time, to Wednesday, but I never sent an email to this person, and even though they know, they'll still show up on Tuesday and not attend the Wednesday meeting,
Yeah.
because they weren't given explicit instruction or something. That passive resistance that people do, and you can see this a lot in really messed up bureaucracies. So this is the part of, with Doge and Trump that I do agree with, that America has such a profoundly entrenched bureaucracy. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of people that are just phoning it in, and you
Mm.
need to chip away at that.
Yeah.
So good systems and good organizational design, they should be self-evolving, and they should be able to identify when people are resisting the mission of the organization, and they should be self-correcting, where they're able to make a deal with those people, or those people will be removed, like an immune
Mm.
system.
Yeah. when you're talking about those hierarchy of needs and systems and the health of systems, I'd love to hear a bit about where your health clinic is at and your experiments you've been trying over the last 6 months. You've talked openly about burnout, which I think is super important for leaders. It's not talked about enough. And yeah, that has had a positive effect for you. So what's happening in the clinic, and do you have any perspectives as a result of the kind of things you've explored in the last 6 to 8 months?
Yeah, so for the clinic, we're doing well. It's one of the largest multi-specialty family-owned clinics in the United States. It's grown by leaps and bounds. We have about 13,000 patients now. So every time I check, the numbers go up.
Wow.
So I'm pretty happy about that. Getting almost 200 visits a day. It's a multi-specialty practice. So everything from primary care to internal cardiology and nephrology and dermatology and neurology. And our service lines continue to expand. Like, for example, we just brought a surgeon on board. And so it's really fun because we can do full service care for people from cradle to grave. We built the clinic as a clinical research site. So while we want to take care of the local community of Gillette, Wyoming, and it's fun to play doctor, the more important thing is medical research. And so we built it for clinical trials. So we have MD PhDs and PhDs that specialize in translational medicine from the basic science. And we're starting our first FDA trial. In fact, I had the paperwork was just submitted last week, and we're in the final parts of starting a phase 1/2 clinical trial, which will be
Fantastic.
used for anti-aging regenerative medicine. So we're
Wow.
combining two modalities. We're combining hyperbaric medicine with adipose-derived allogeneic stem cells. And our belief is that stem cells combined with hyperbarics will have a very strong anti-aging signal. And so we have all the diagnostic capabilities to be able to actually measure that. And by next year, we should have our first cohort of data, and we'll be able to analyze that. But we think we reverse aging with this technique by about 10 years. So we're
Wow.
really excited about that prospect. And suddenly I'm everybody's friend. You know,
Yeah, I bet.
they don't give a shit about the crypto. They're like,
I
whatever
want
that crypto, that's
anti-aging.
the,
Yeah.
but the anti-aging, anybody over the
Oh,
age of
yeah.
50 is just like, that is awesome. I want to know more. Please tell me when that product is available. So that's very nice. And it's cool because the science skills we gained running one of the largest research groups in the world for cryptocurrencies are directly transferable to good scholarship in the biotechnology realm. Sans the domain specific deltas of things, but we have some great people. Like our chief scientist there, Sanjay Dar, came from University of California, and he's a very smart guy, and he's done many FDA trials, and so he has the requisite experience to be able to kind of lead that. And there's some wonderful physician scientists we have, like we have one, Dr. Sam Navan, is an MD PhD research ophthalmologist, and he's just incredibly bright, one of the
Mm.
smartest people I've ever met. So it's a very fertile environment for these types of things. And what's cool is it's a platform. So as we get deeper into it, we can do more with stem cells. Like one thing I imagine we'll start doing is start exploring the whole pipeline of how stem cells are culture expanded for autologous transplants. And so everything from improving the extraction techniques so that they're less invasive to combining the culture media with exosomes. In particular, I'm really interested in umbilical cord blood exosomes for culture media expansion. And then also just photobiomodulation. Apparently, you can use yellow light activation with stem cells, and it radically improves their efficacy. So,
Mm.
and you can grow them in an anoxic environment. There's all kinds of things you can do, even magnetic levitation with
Wow.
the stem cells to
Yeah.
replicate zero G environments, and so you get these
Mm.
beautiful spherical cells that are much better adhering to tissue. Some second order considerations we're also looking at is combining stem cell therapies with co-administration for tissue specific targeting.
Mm.
So one of the concerns that some people have is that stem cells, when you do a systemic injection, they tend to just bunch up in the lungs.
Right.
And I say, well, can we get them in other tissue types? And can we coax them to cross the blood-brain barrier or coax them to aggregate in the liver or, in the peripherals, for peripheral neuropathies, especially relevant for people who've had chemotherapy? And
Right.
the answer is yes. You can
Mm,
co-administer stem cells with different things to actually enhance their mobility throughout the body and efficacy. In
mm,
fact, that's why we're pairing it with hyperbarics, because that seems to do that really, really well in a systemic way. So all kinds of cool ideas that we have, and because we have a platform in the physicians, year by year, we're able to build up and develop more scholarship and more good ideas, and eventually roll these things out into market. And they're quite transformational. I mean,
mm.
just simple things
Yeah.
like a lipolyzed adipose-derived stem cell could potentially be used to treat anosmia, which
Mm,
is loss of smell. And there's millions of Americans, myself included, who've lost a great deal of smell from COVID.
right.
So being able to bring that back,
Mm.
it doesn't work so well when you're traveling on planes, but you know, it's great. It's great in general to be able to smell the roses again.
Yeah.
Or, you know, well, so many people have just neuropathies and they have balance issues and, you know,
Mm,
real bad cold tolerance and heat tolerance because of those neuropathies. And just to be able to recover something that's perceived to be a lifelong condition is a phenomenal thing, above and beyond the fact that we can longevity, you know, increase people's lifespan. So gerotherapeutics is just a great field to be in. With respect to work-life balance and you know, other things, you know, I've tried some of the things there. We have a mental health program at my clinic. Right now, we've been very focused in things like transcranial magnetic stimulation. We have a MagStim at the clinic, and we use it to
mm.
treat depression. Our
Okay.
clinical data is phenomenal with it.
Wow.
About 45% of the time, we see substantial improvements with drug-resistant depression.
Wow.
In some of the patients, it's totally resolved. They have actually
Wow.
gotten off of SSRIs. So
Wow.
I was surprised to see the efficacy of that treatment.
Yeah.
We're also exploring more traditional things, like we've looked at darkness retreats, and we've looked at you know, setting up a ketamine clinic. I did a ketamine therapy last year, and it
Yeah.
was quite successful. So we
Yeah.
really like those pharmacokinetic interventions for anti-anxiety and mental health augmentation. So
Mm,
we spent quite a bit of time actually thinking about how to build a psychedelics program, but this is
mm.
where the law just gets in the way, you know, because I
Yeah.
would love to explore mescaline and psilocybin and other things. And we know all the people at MAPS, and they have great protocols that they've developed, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, it just
Can't
we
do it.
can't explore those.
Mm,
But there are ways to get around it. Like, for example, one of the things we're researching right now is, can vibroacoustic medicine be used to create endogenous DMT?
mm,
So that would be totally legal. And you
mm.
can potentially do that with a medical device as opposed to an injection of a
Right.
substance.
Mm.
So that's exciting. And
Yeah.
that's
Very
one of
exciting.
our physicians is, you know, heavily involved in that. But it's tough. It's
Yeah.
really tough. The best mental health advice I can give to a public figure is get the hell off social media.
Mm.
It's now become, I'm convinced, a net negative, and
Yeah.
hire a team, have a group of people manage and moderate that. I am in the process of a transition where I'm going to moderate my Twitter to another group of people, and just get completely out of social media altogether. It's
Mm.
just no longer doing anything for me. It's become so toxic and parasitic and just mean and downright
Yeah.
damn. And there's no real value in it. It's just like an attention-starved mob that's looking for their next victim to go and attack.
Mm-hmm.
So I just disconnect, dopamine detox, get out of social media. I think that alone will make people immeasurably happier. And then just embrace mindfulness and really focus on techniques to enhance the present.
Mm.
Those are the kinds of things that I think people need to emphasize and invest in.
Yeah. What's something about running Cardano that would surprise people who only know you from this public persona?
I think that what people don't understand is that Cardano is something I've invested 10 years in, and I brought an amazing group of people and an amazing ecosystem to bear. And so I learn just as much from them as they learn from me. I do these whiteboard videos and I talk to people, but they're always giving me advice and suggestions, and I do listen. And then I'm willing to listen. You know, people have this idea that I'm very stuck in my ways and I have very strong opinions and I'm unable to broach things. And usually when people meet me and spend time with me, they say, "Oh, you're a lot friendlier than I thought you would be." Yeah, I'm like, thanks. Gee, thanks.
Gee, yeah.
So
Mm,
I do enjoy learning and I do enjoy collaborating and I do enjoy working with people Where I have problems is when I think people are doing things that are criminal or dishonest or will result in the harm of others.
Mm,
And that's when I tend to speak up. And when I do, it's problematic because
mm,
those people then lash out and we get into a fight. And people only see the surface level thing and they say, oh, Charles is in another fight. Well, you have to remember, I'm in the industry where I lived through Mt. Gox and BitConnect and OneCoin and hundreds
yeah,
of these garbage things, Luna,
yeah.
FTX. I remember talking to people who were invested in Luna, and
Mm-hmm,
I created the first algorithmic stablecoin with Dan Larimer. It was called BitShares. So
mm-hmm,
we've been in this algorithmic stablecoin business since 2013.
mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of experience with these things. And all the models that we built with BitShares, they collapsed if it was a fractional reserve and had to be over collateralized. So I asked sheepishly to the people who built Luna, well, how do you prevent a bank run if there's high volatility in the market? And they
Right.
couldn't answer the question. And sure enough, $40 billion of value was lost. So when I
Wow.
was criticizing Luna, I looked like a bad guy. And everybody only focused on that. I somehow missed my apology in the mail, for these types of things,
Yeah.
go figure. And those people are still around today, like the Mike Novogratzes of the world, for example, who got the Luna tattoo, goes around telling everybody Cardano is a cult and all these things. And he neglects to mention that he was heavily invested in Luna, and we were critics of it.
Mm,
And so there's consequences when you do the right thing, you say the right thing. People don't like those whistleblowers. And I think that's something that people miss. And then you just get fatigued about it. And you start thinking, is it still worthwhile calling truth to power and saying, hey, there's bad things, especially when people are very petty. But
mm,
I am me and I
yeah.
can't not be me. So I'm always going to be that guy. So I love being collaborative and, I love fighting the good fight when I think there's something there. And I hope people respect me for that.
Mm, I'm sure they do. What are you reading at the moment, Charles?
Oh, well, there's one book, I forget the author, it's on time expansion experiences, TEEs. I've had a few in my life, most of us have, and they're usually around some sort of event. Like, for example, you're in a car accident or, you've been shot or something traumatic has happened. And then it just feels like time is frozen and your
Mm-hmm,
perception of time gets hyper aware for some
mm-hmm,
reason,
mm-hmm,
or you're in flow and time seems to contract and you spend 3 hours doing something and it feels like it's 5 minutes.
mm,
So you lose sense of time. Your internal chronometer goes to hell. Well, the book is basically discussing that. And the reason why I've become interested in this is there's a substance called salvia, and it seems to really screw with people's perception of time. It creates time dilation or these TEEs. So one person took salvia and he took too large of a dose and he woke up completely disassociated, woke up as another person in a different place. So he lived in Alaska and woke up with somebody in Texas and like lived for 10 years in another person's body, like married to somebody, going to work, all this type of stuff. And for the first years, like Captain Picard in the Inner Light, it's like, this is not my life. These aren't my kids. And eventually accepted his fate and then woke up like in Alaska after 10 years of this experience and was only out for 2 minutes, with the salvia experience. So after reading that story, however anecdotal, I said, wow, that's incredible. So I'm very interested in time expansion experiences and where and when can these things be tuned and how can you use them and how valuable they are. Um, I'm also I tend to read a lot of biographies about people, and I get fascinated with various historical figures. One in particular that I've been reading about is Alfred North Whitehead, and he has this weird philosophical system. I knew him from the mathematics world because he co-authored a book with Bertrand Russell called The Principles of Mathematics, and their seminal work was proving that 1 + 1 = 2. It took them about 1,000 pages to do that. You got to find logic and arithmetic together. Their
yeah.
life's work was sadly undone by Gödel and Turing, but
Mm,
they still were brilliant people. And Alfred North Whitehead went on to kind of create this really interesting panpsychic philosophy in the world. So I'm kind of trying to wrap my mind around it. I don't quite understand enough, but there's a few things that I'm reading there. But I try to have a diverse set of things that I at any given time I look at usually a topic and I try to develop a syntopical understanding around it. So
mm,
I'll pull thing from one book and pull thing from an article or other thing, and you just go digging. And that's the nature of knowledge, is that knowledge is networked and topics are networked and everything is kind of an aggregation of a collection of things.
Yeah.
Um, the human capacity also for manifestation is a really interesting one. There's a book from a neurosurgeon on that. And basically, you can subconsciously program yourself to, believe something is going to happen, and it kind of guides your behavior and perceptions in a way where you start creating the outcomes. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of believe that because you see learned helplessness. If people think, "Oh, I'm just not going to succeed," they don't
Right.
succeed. Go figure.
Right.
And when you see like elite athletes, they almost have this supernatural belief that they will find a way to win no matter what
Yeah.
happens. Tom Brady will come back from 24 points or something. You say, well, how the hell did that guy do that? They're like
Yeah.
manifesting reality. So it turns out that there's some deep neuroscience behind this. And it turns out that apparently it's something you can control and tune. And as an entrepreneur, I always figured this would be an interesting thing to explore. Also spending quite a bit of time these days reading about quantum computers. After
Mm.
Majorana was announced, I said, all right, I got to get on the train because I'm the guy who has to figure out how to like quantum harden Cardano. And so I got an army of scientists, but we have to kind of make some bets on the roadmap. So what I'm trying to get a deeper understanding of is, the level of generality and things like Grover's algorithm and Shor's algorithm and, you know, how these things come together for us and when do we have to get on the boat? Because the problem with post-quantum algorithms is that they're very inefficient, usually 5 to 10 times larger key sizes and 5 to 10 times as much computation. So nobody wants to be the guy to say, "Hey, let's make Cardano 10 times slower." So there has to be a third option there. So I've been thinking very deeply about these things with some subject matter experts, and to have those conversations, I kind of have to upgrade my understanding of all these things, and it's quite a
Mm.
bit of work because it's not exactly an accessible topic.
Are they the kind of things that keep you up at night? What kind of things keep you awake at night?
Well, I don't want to let people down. And so I always ask, did I earn the day? Did I do my best and try and put in the effort, or do I feel like I coasted today? And the things when I get kept up at night is when I feel like I've coasted instead of actually putting in the effort. Whether good things or bad things happen, I have a pragmatic, optimistic belief that we'll find a way. Might not be perfect, but we'll find a way. I had a friend who ran the Boston Marathon, and he had terrible diarrhea. And he said, and I asked him what happened. He said, sometimes you got to shit while you run. So being an entrepreneur is this way, you're in the marathon, you're running, there's no way you can stop for the bathroom. You're on the clock, so you just go and you hope for the best. And they have the hose on the other side to spray you off. So I don't really care if there's some issues from time to time. We'll figure them out. But I don't like letting people down. I really try hard to do my best. And what keeps me up at night is when I feel like I failed, the community and the people around. The other thing that keep me up at night is when I think that something is happening where we lack the requisite wisdom to fully appreciate and understand the appropriate response. Like COVID was a great example of this, where the real lesson of COVID was we should not play around with synthetic biology and gain of function research in the way that we are, because it's creating a situation where we are killing millions of people. And we got lucky in that it was not really that bad of a virus, all things considered. And yet the response to it has been to just ignore that event and just continue doing what we're doing. And the next time this happens, it's going to kill 500 million people or 1 billion people. And owning a synthetic biology company and being heavily involved in this field and seeing how easy it is to use CRISPR and manipulate things. One of the companies we invested in just created the woolly mouse. They took woolly mammoth
Yes.
DNA and they
So,
put it into the mouse,
yes.
and cool,
Yeah.
cool and
It's very
fluffy.
cute. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cute. And that's the fun side of synthetic biology. COVID is the bad side of it. And you have to think holistically about this. And if we don't, really bad outcomes will occur. So stuff like that keeps me up at night when I clearly see that there's a structural problem that's going to create enormous harm for people. And there's other people like Ian LeCun lays in bed sweating and are we creating artificial intelligence to end all of humanity? Everybody has a demon that kind of hunts them and chases them down. Mine is Synbio is that demon. But then, it is what it is. I
Yeah.
can't complain. I got a ranch. I got bison. Life
Bison.
life life isn't too bad.
Yeah. If we look at the intersection of blockchain governance and game theory, what do you think are fundamental human coordination problems that you think we're closest to solving? And which ones do you think still are evading us in terms of a solution, or a solution that's elegant anyway?
Well, we know we can coordinate people at a large scale. What we haven't mastered is coordinating people at a large scale to solve a common resource problem. So we can create a network like Ethereum or Bitcoin or Cardano, but we haven't been able to create like a parallel of OpenAI
Mm,
or a depend system like Verizon. We haven't been able to solve decentralized infrastructure. We've tried with World Mobile and AI chains like Near and these other things, but they haven't reached a point where they're competitive and become the market standard over the others. And that's unfortunate because once you've developed one, you have a kind of a skeleton key for how to do that for any service or function. And then you can start truly decentralizing most of
mm,
society. So I'd like to solve that problem before I retire. And we have some ideas. Midnight is certainly a big movement momentum in a particular direction, but it's an open question. But I'd say we're making meaningful progress as an industry. We're learning fee markets and dual tokenomics, and we're learning how to tune monetary policy to do various things. The Ethereum ecosystem has done a pretty good work correcting poor protocol design using economics. It's like
mhm.
they have the slashing and bonding and all this stuff. It's utterly unnecessary. And we keep telling them, like, Cardano's been running for 7 years now, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and
Yeah.
we don't have any slashing and bonding. And they're like that one guy. He's like, God's gonna smite you. He's cooking something up. And it's like, maybe, just maybe, you don't need these features, right?
Yeah.
But they have them. But they've learned a lot about human
Yeah.
behavior with optimistic roll-ups and all these other things of where and when people cheat and how they cheat and what they do. Um, MEV is another example of bad behavior. So I think just having a stark realization that these economic systems will be misused and abused in every possible way, and that you have to engineer them for Byzantine behavior, has really
Mm,
integrated itself into the core of the industry. And every protocol that we design, has those characteristics. But we haven't learned well how to direct that yet,
yeah.
outside of a common resource like computation, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of questions just to wrap up, Charles. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and every company in the world has suddenly adopted decentralized governance. What's the first thing that breaks and the first thing that thrives?
Well, I don't think they're going to do any worse than what's going on right now. I mean, I guess Canada is the 51st state. So it's like, what, we're just not, we're gonna have more wars, we'll have more governance failures. I think it'll be exactly the same. It just, the difference is it'll be a lot more transparent, and the difference is that it's directional. Science is directional. We have an
Mm,
expectation in engineering and in physics and in mathematics and biology that if you go into a coma and wake up in 50 years, that everything will be more advanced, that technology will be more advanced.
right.
Could you imagine getting knocked out 1975 when Jimmy Carter is running for president against Gerald Ford, and then waking up in 2025 and seeing the world of today? You have your disco
What?
pants on and your disco stew and everything, and you're just like,
Need
what
some more
what is going
LSD.
on? This is
Yeah.
nuts.
Yeah.
Like, but you imagine those changes. And so it's
Mm,
the same here. If you go into a coma today in 2025, you wake up 2075, you say, well, what's the world going to look like? Social systems, though, do they improve? Can we say that the US government is less or more corrupt today
mm,
than it was
mhm,
in 1975? Can we say that the US government is more bureaucratic or less bureaucratic, more efficient, less efficient?
right.
It's not really that clear, and it depends on who you ask, and
Yeah.
where people sit. So
Mm,
social systems have no expectation of default progress like science
mm,
systems have.
mhm,
And the hope behind blockchains and decentralization is that they actually make social systems behave like the STEM fields, where
mm,
they actually improve and they self-refresh and self-correct, instead of what they typically do, which is become cyclic, where they get super bureaucratic and corrupt and they collapse. One of my favorite periods in in history was during the late ninth century in Europe. It was called the Cadaver Synod. Did you ever hear of that?
I don't think
So
so.
it says it's peak Catholicism. Being baptized Catholic, I can pick on the church a little bit, but
Hmm.
in the ninth century, Pope Formosus died, and he was a rival of this cardinal who became pope, and it was Pope Stephen the Sixth. And anyway, Stephen the Sixth hated Formosus so much that he decided to put his corpse on trial. And so they exhumed his body, and they actually had a deacon speak for him. They had the zombie pope just kind of sitting there, and they had a whole trial for a corpse. And then
Wow.
eventually they convicted the zombie pope and they sentenced him to extra death, which meant they cut his blessing fingers off and they threw him into the Tiber River. But it's a very famous period. I actually have a painting from Jean-Paul Laurens in my office, which is like this beautiful painting of the Cadaver Synod. But
Wow.
it's just like peak insanity. It's like who the fuck
Yes.
puts a corpse on trial? I mean,
Right.
what are you doing? This is
What are
so
we
stupid.
doing? Yeah.
Yeah, what are we doing here? But then you have to think like this is not just like one guy. It's like every cardinal in the church is involved, the
Right.
press is involved.
Yeah.
Every day somebody has to dress the dead pope in his papal regalia and carry the dead pope to the courtroom. There's a
Weekend at
deacon there that
Bernie's.
has to
Right.
prepare a defense.
Right.
They cross-examined the pope. So Stephen the Sixth was like, I'll question the Pope, and it's like his
Right.
silence indicates guilt. You know, this is the madness of it.
Completely
So for
insane.
it's completely insane, but that's a social system. And, and
Yes.
and from the
Yes.
outside, when we see that, we're like, that is completely nuts. But
Mm-hmm.
it
Wait.
but
Yeah.
if had we existed in that time period, we'd all be like, are you going to the Pope trial, the zombie Pope trial? Like, oh yeah, yeah. I don't know if he's gonna get convicted or not, God willing.
Yeah.
These types of things. So there is this this proximal temporal proximity to hysteria in social systems
Yes.
that is which is
Yes.
quite crazy. And like this era of Trump right now is probably the same. And if somebody from 1975 was looking at it today, they'd be like, what the hell is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And then if somebody in 2075 looks at it, they'd be like, what the hell is going on? But we're having our cadavers in on right now. It's a pretty crazy thing. So my hope
Yeah.
with blockchains is it removes those features of these
Yeah.
systems and it transfers them into more of a scientific system where you make decade by decade social progress and it's
Yeah.
immutable and you don't tend to regress.
Yeah.
Technology can regress too, but usually it's a complete failure of the system.
Right.
Like you saw that with the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, where we kind of went to dark ages for a little bit and
Yes.
regressed technologically, and it took a little while to get back to things. By the
Yeah.
way, I think they were also going to do that to Trump. After he
Yeah.
died, they'll exhume his corpse and put him on trial. Do
Modern
the
day
whole thing.
version. You have to get
Yeah,
a painting.
exactly
You have to get
right.
a painting of that as well. Um,
Exactly right. I'll have one
you have a
made.
new painting. That's right.
Yeah.
Charles, you've often said you're not interested in being the richest man in the world, but in solving, really hard problems. What problem would give you the most satisfaction to solve?
I think the combination of quantum computing with AI would be the problem that if we solve that problem, would transform humanity in ways that are both unpredictable and godlike. Um, you, you know, because here's the thing, when you have a large language model, it's doing all these calculations and it gives you an output. And then you kind of look at it and you say, does that look right? And then if it looks right, then maybe you have a chain of thought and you keep going output to output. And eventually, like a workflow, you can get to a good answer. Well, with a quantum system, you get a sneak peek of all these outputs. So imagine an AI system where you can look at a million possibilities or a billion possibilities at the same time, and then you can cascade that hyperdimensionally into many different areas. Um, that's not just a small thing. What that does is it allows you to understand the world, and your cognition, your cognitive capacity for the world is so strong that you can start like getting the cheat codes to the reality. Like here's an example. There's a technology that Microsoft has called Matternet, and it allows you to kind of ask a question like, I want a battery with these properties and blah, blah, blah. And it'll tell you what material you need to do to make that. Well, it can't simulate more than 30 to 50 electrons of interaction unless you have a supercomputer. And even then, maybe 60, because it grows exponentially with the amount of bonding pairs and these other things. But with a quantum system, you can just simulate as far as you want to go. So actually what will end up happening is like you'll create these exotic materials that can pretty much do anything, like room temperature, superconductor, high entropy alloy with all these weird properties. And it also can be used for compute and these things, and just blows your mind. So when you combine those two capabilities together, that's the skeleton key to reality. And then what's cool about that is that you can create all these derivations of things. Um, like there's this book on how to build a nanobrain, and like how to build a synthetic mind. Well, kind of just tell you how to do that. And yeah, there's all these exotic things you need, like time crystals and so forth, to make that work. Well, you can do it now with
Yeah.
such a system. So that would be super cool to figure out something like that. And that's on the STEM side. On the social side, one of the things I've been very deeply interested in is aggregating all the esoteric knowledge that humanity has produced into one place, translating all of it into one universal language, and then extracting all the common trends and patterns from it.
Mm.
So you have like
Yeah.
Manly P. Hall's book that he wrote, and the Kybalion, and all this modern esoteric knowledge, and then everything from the Rosicrucians, and everything from the Gnostics, and all these ancient wisdom traditions, these ancient cults like Mistra and so forth, the Eleusinian mysteries. There's
Mm-hmm.
fragments of these things that exist,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
there are many different traditions, and they have all these ways of thinking about the construction of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really start studying them, you notice that there's some connection points
Mm-hmm.
that seem to be common in different places. Like when you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead and you
Mm-hmm.
compare it to esoteric traditions and Jewish lore, then you say, hang on a second here, there's an overlap, and these people never met each other and never traveled. So how do they have the same insights? There must be some gnosis. There must be some like experiential thing that they gain from
Mm-hmm.
deep thought. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's the other project that would be uniquely interesting to mankind, is to put all that stuff together meticulously, which would take probably a century, and then to use AI to do a deep analysis of all these things and start networking and linking the knowledge together. And then you would create kind of a transcendent knowledge for the two. So those two capabilities together kind of solve
Mm.
your problem. One is the cheat codes for reality, and then the
Right.
other one is the why behind
Yeah.
reality. It's kind of the
Yeah.
guidebook, for
Yeah.
what to do and how to do these things. And that's much more meaningful than being, the world's richest man, or, being president, or any of these things. Because again, you're doing something at a scale and a level for people that would transcend centuries and millennia.
Yeah.
Whatever book you derived from all that esoteric knowledge would be probably something on par with the Bible or
Yeah.
the Quran or any of these other wisdom texts from that are handed down generation by generation, but much more meaningful because it would be a gestalt of
Mm.
everybody, and not just
Mm.
one particular lens.
It would be amazing. Charles, is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have?
Well, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
If you were a cookie, what type of cookie would you be?
Well, actually, over Christmas, I took my children to the States and they went far too many times to Crumble Cookie and spent a very large amount of money at Crumble Cookie, which was a whole experience. In the Waymo, they were so excited to go in a Waymo. So that was a whole experience. So any of the Crumble cookies seem to be pretty good, which is not a very committal answer, but way too sweet. Australians don't really like things that sweet, but yeah, it's a good question.
I
And it
know it's one of those things that has no right answer.
has
It's
no right answer. I know.
yeah,
Yeah. What
yeah.
about you? What sort of cookie would you be?
Well, there's only one answer. It's chocolate chip.
Choc chip. Yeah. Cookie dough. I think cookie dough. Choc chip cookie dough. That would be
Oh
my
my
answer
Lord.
for sure.
I ate
Right?
so much raw cookie dough in that's maybe why I'm so
Yeah.
messed up in the head.
I don't think so. Well, yeah, I look forward to all of those things you talked about coming to fruition, Charles. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Libby. Cheers.